The air above an American city in the winter of 1922 had a particular smell to it. Coal smoke and cold stone, the faint mineral tang of river water carried on a northwest wind. And beneath all that, something industrial and persistent that clung to coats and settled into lungs over years. The Great War had ended 4 years before, and its losses, more than 116,000 American military dead, have been absorbed into the forward motion of the decade with a kind of deliberate practicality. The way a river absorbs a stone and keeps moving. The cities were growing. The factories were running. There was money to be made, and a great many people were making it. In the textile districts of the Carolinas, looms ran through the night and into gray morning, tended by hands of all sizes. In Pennsylvania's coal regions, boys who had not yet reached their 13th year crouched in the narrow passages of breaker houses, separating slate from coal by touch, in air thick with anthracite dust. In New York and Chicago and Detroit, new arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe pressed into tenement blocks and factory shifts, navigating particular uncertainty of a country that was, in those years, still working out how many of them it intended to welcome. Along the department store counters of Fifth Avenue and Michigan Avenue, women examined jars and bottles of cosmetic preparations displayed beneath electric light, products bearing the endorsements of physicians and the language of modern science, whose ingredient lists would have warranted careful scrutiny had the regulations of the day required them to be printed at all. None of this was hidden. It was simply ordinary, the unremarkable texture of a decade that believed, with considerable sincerity, that it knew what it was doing. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution had been ratified in January 1919, the product of a temperance campaign that had occupied reformers, church associations, and civic organizations across the country for the better part of half a century. The legislation that gave the amendment its enforcement mechanism, the National Prohibition Act, known almost universally as the Volstead Act after its chief congressional sponsor, Representative Andrew Volstead of Minnesota, came into effect on the 17th of January, 1920. The law prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors within the United States, defining intoxicating as any beverage containing more than 0.5% alcohol by volume. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most ambitious pieces of social legislation the federal government had ever attempted, premised on conviction that a country of 105 million people could be persuaded, through law alone, to abandon a habit embedded in its culture, its commerce, its agricultural economy, and the daily domestic life of the majority of its adult population. What the law did not do, and what would come to matter enormously over the following decade, was eliminate the desire for alcohol among the tens of millions of Americans who had, until the previous day, been drinking it legally. Demand of that scale, combined with strict federal prohibition, produce exactly what economic reasoning would predict: an immediate and vigorous black market, supplied within months by illicit distilleries, converted warehouses, and a distribution network that spread across cities, counties, and state lines with a fluency that bore some relationship to the energy the country's legitimate commercial economy had always brought to moving goods from one place to another. By the mid-1920s, New York City alone was estimated to contain somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 establishments where alcohol could be purchased, the range reflecting the fundamental difficulty of counting something designed to be hidden. Chicago's criminal networks, including the organization that operated under the effective control of Alphonse Capone by the late 1920s, had developed the production and distribution of illegal liquor into something resembling a modern commercial enterprise, with wholesale prices, territorial agreements, purchase political protection, and a degree of logistical organization that the Prohibition Bureau was never adequately equipped to match. The economic incentives were so powerful, and the profit margin so considerable, that law enforcement pressure functioned less as a deterrent than as a cost of doing business, an occasional disruption to supply chains that the market simply absorbed and routed around. The Prohibition Bureau itself had been established within the Treasury Department and placed, in its early years, under the direction of Roy Haynes, a former small-town Ohio newspaper editor whose chief qualification for position was his background in temperance advocacy rather than in law enforcement or public administration. The Bureau was chronically underfunded and dramatically understaffed relative to the mandate it had been given. By 1923, approximately 1,500 agents were responsible for enforcing the law across the entirety of the continental United States, a country of nearly 3.5 million square miles, with thousands of miles of coastline, hundreds of land border crossing points, and a domestic transportation network that moved goods by rail, road, and river in quantities that no inspection regime of 1,500 people could meaningfully monitor. Many of those agents earned between $30 and $50 per week in cities where bootleggers could offer considerably more than a government salary for a moment of deliberate inattention, a closed door, or a report that happened to omit a particular address. Corruption was pervasive, periodically prosecuted, and consistently replaced by new instances of the same thing. What enforcement could not achieve, certain powerful figures within the Temperance Coalition believed might be achieved through other means entirely. Chief among those figures was Wayne Wheeler, the general counsel and principal political strategist of the Anti-Saloon League of America, the organization that had, over the preceding 3 decades, developed a capacity for congressional influence that had few equivalents in American political life. Wheeler was a methodical and tenacious operator from Brookfield Township, Ohio, who had worked for the League since 1894 and who had developed, over that span, a sophisticated system of electoral targeting, identifying vulnerable legislators in competitive districts, mobilizing church congregations as voting blocks, flooding congressional committees with coordinated correspondence that was sufficiently effective that the Washington Press Corps described him in 1926 as the most influential unelected individual in the Capitol. His commitment was not merely that prohibition should exist as law, but that it should be enforced to its absolute limit, that the penalties for non-compliance should be as severe as the political system would permit, and that any legislative softening of the law should be resisted at every stage. The specific problem that Wheeler and his allies fixed upon was the diversion of industrial alcohol, ethanol, the molecular compound at the base of every drinkable spirit, was also an essential ingredient in dozens of industrial processes. It served as a solvent in the manufacture of perfumes and lacquers, as a base compound in antifreeze formulations, as a cleaning agent in pharmaceutical production, and as a raw material in the manufacture of dyes, rubber, and a wide range of chemical products on which the country's industrial economy depended. The Volstead Act therefore permitted the continued legal production of ethanol for these industrial purposes, on a condition that it be rendered undrinkable through the addition of toxic or unpalatable compounds, a process called denaturing, which had existed in some form since the late 19th century. By the early 1920s, licensed manufacturers were producing approximately 60 million gallons of denatured industrial alcohol per year, under a standard government formula that required the addition of 10 parts methyl alcohol per 100 parts of ethanol. Methyl alcohol is also called methanol or wood alcohol. It was entirely suited to industrial applications involving solvents and fuels. What distinguished methanol from drinkable ethanol at the level of human physiology was the way the liver processed it. Ethanol is metabolized primarily into acetaldehyde and then into acetic acid, compound the body handles with relative efficiency. Methanol, processed by the same liver enzymes, becomes formaldehyde and then formic acid, substances that are acutely toxic to human tissue and that carry a particular destructive affinity for the optic nerve. As little as 10 milliliters of methanol can cause permanent blindness in an adult. Larger quantities, the amounts present in a few glasses of inadequately clean bootleg spirit, can cause systemic organ failure and death over the course of hours. The sensory experience of methanol poisoning was described in hospital records of the period as beginning with a period that resembled ordinary intoxication, followed by a deceptive interval of apparent recovery, and then by a rapid onset of severe headache, visual disturbance, and in the most acute cases a sudden and complete loss of sight, a progression that gave physicians very little time in which to intervene effectively. The government's denaturing formula, which added 10 parts of methanol to every 100 parts of industrial ethanol, produced a blend that was genuinely dangerous to consume. Bootleggers had, from early in the Prohibition period, employed chemists to remove the denaturing compounds through redistillation and filtration, and a skilled chemist working with adequate equipment could reduce the methanol content of a batch to relatively low levels. But the market for bootleg spirits was large. The operations supplying it were of wildly varying quality, and the person purchasing a bottle had no reliable means of knowing whether what was inside, had been cleaned adequately or inadequately. A batch processed by a competent chemist with proper apparatus might retain methanol concentrations low enough to be consumed without acute harm. A batch processed hastily with cruder equipment might retain concentrations several times higher, and the two bottles, sitting side by side on a speakeasy shelf, would have been visually indistinguishable. In 1926, under sustained pressure from Wheeler and from elements within the Prohibition Bureau who argued that the existing denaturing formula was insufficiently effective as a deterrent, the Treasury Department issued revised formulas requiring manufacturers to add substantially more toxic compounds to their industrial alcohol. The new government-mandated formula specified, in addition to methanol in concentrations as high as 4 parts per 10, the addition of benzene, a compound that scientific literature of the period was beginning to associate with serious chronic health effects. Kerosene, which carries a chemical signature that redistillation cannot reliably eliminate. Chloroform, acetone, camphor, brucine, a compound. Chemically related to strychnine, and iodine. The specific proportions varied by formula number. The government maintained an official list of approved denaturing formulas, each designated by number, and manufacturers were legally required to use only approved combinations. Some of those combinations were formulated specifically to resist the redistilling techniques that bootleg chemists were known to use. The practical implication of this was that they were formulated specifically to remain present in the alcohol when it reached the person who drank it. James Doran, who directed the Industrial Alcohol Division of the Prohibition Bureau and who oversaw the development of the revised formulas, understood what the compounds he was mandating would do to a human body. He stated in congressional testimony that the denaturing program was a deliberate deterrent, designed to make the consequences of consuming industrial alcohol sufficiently severe that the black market would be forced to find other sources or collapse. Wayne Wheeler made the government's position even more direct in public statements and in correspondence published in the New York press, arguing that the deaths of people who chose to drink illegal alcohol were self-inflicted and that the government bore no legal or moral responsibility for the choices of those who broke the law. The person who drinks this industrial alcohol is a deliberate suicide, Wheeler was recorded as saying in the New York World in 1926, and the government need not hesitate to take measures to protect the public from the consequences of their illegal acts. The Christmas and New Year's holiday period spanning 1926 and 1927 produced what had been accumulating for several years in visible and concentrated form. In New York City, over a single holiday weekend, approximately 400 people were admitted to municipal hospitals, Bellevue, Harlem Hospital, and Metropolitan Hospital among them, presenting with symptoms that physicians on the wards had learned over preceding years to recognize with particular weariness. The presentation typically followed a characteristic arc, a period resembling ordinary drunkenness, then apparent recovery, then the onset of severe headache and disorientation, then the disturbance of vision that moved, in the most severe cases, from blurring to near total blindness within the space of hours, and then, for those whose poison was acute enough, the progressive failure of respiratory function. More than 60 people died in New York City alone during that period. The victims were concentrated, as alcohol-related hospital admissions tended to be throughout the Prohibition years, among the residents of the poorest urban neighborhoods. People buying the cheapest available spirits because they could not afford anything more, and the cheapest spirits were the ones that had passed through the fewest redistilling stages and retained the most of the government's added compounds. Charles Norris had been appointed as New York City's first professional chief medical examiner in 1918, under reform of the city system that had replaced the previous. Coroner's office, a position historically awarded on the basis of political connections, with one requiring formal medical and pathological training. Norris was a demanding and occasionally combative administrator who had spent his career insisting that the determination of cause of death be approached with the same rigor that applied to any other branch of medicine. His laboratory director, Alexander Gettler, was a forensic toxicologist of Ukrainian birth who had emigrated to the United States as a child and who had spent his professional life developing chemical methods capable of identifying and precisely measuring specific toxic compounds in human tissue. Gettler had devised many of his techniques himself, in the absence of existing protocols, and the laboratory he ran for the medical examiner's office had, by the mid-1920s, a diagnostic capacity that was without parallel in American public health. Gettler's analyses of the tissue and blood samples taken from the bodies admitted to the New York morgue during and after the 1926 holiday period established, with a precision that was not credibly disputable, that the victims had been killed by methanol and by the benzene and chloroform compounds present in government-denatured industrial alcohol that had been inadequately redistilled. The chemical profiles he produced were specific, not the pattern of fermentation-related impurities found in poorly made beer or wine, but the signature of compounds whose presence in those concentrations could only be explained by the Treasury Department's own mandated formulas. Norris brought these findings to the press with a directness that was unusual for a municipal official, and that he pursued without apparent concern for the institutional friction it created. He was recorded in December of 1926 as telling reporters that the United States government had killed these men as surely as if it had put the poison in their hands itself. The statement was reported in the New York Times, the New York World, and other papers. It was rebutted by Prohibition Bureau officials, and was absorbed by the political establishment with no appreciable legislative consequence. Congressional hearings were held in the years following, and a number of legislators introduced bills that would have required the government to use only non-lethal denaturing agents, compounds that made industrial alcohol genuinely unpalatable without making it acutely toxic. None of those bills advanced to a floor vote. The political coalition that had built Prohibition remained powerful enough and sufficiently committed to the position that drinkers bore sole responsibility for the outcomes of their choices, to block any modification that might be characterized as an accommodation of illegal behavior. The moral argument that people who chose to drink during Prohibition had, in Wheeler's formulation, chosen their own fate, proved more durable within the legislative process than the medical argument, even after the medical argument had been documented with forensic precision in the files of the city's own chief medical examiner. Wayne Wheeler died of heart and kidney failure in September of 1927, less than a year after the holiday poisonings he had publicly defended. James Doran continued in government service through the remaining years of Prohibition. Charles Norris retired from the medical examiner's office in 1935 and died that same year, having spent nearly 2 decades constructing an institution committed to applying scientific standards to questions that the political system found inconvenient. Prohibition itself was repealed in December of 1933 with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, the only constitutional amendment in American history to undo a previous one. The denaturing program ended with it, not through legal reckoning, not through any formal accounting of what it cost, but simply because a framework that had justified it ceased to exist. The total deaths attributable to government-denatured alcohol across the 14 years of Prohibition remain a matter of historical estimation rather than precise record. Deborah Blum, drawing on the forensic documentation accumulated by Norris and Gettler and on public health data from major American cities, arrived at a figure somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 dead, the lower number representing what could be demonstrated in jurisdictions with functioning medical examiner systems, the upper number accounting for the deaths attributed in less rigorous systems to causes that the available chemistry would have identified differently. The survivors who experienced lasting effects, permanent blindness, neurological damage, compromised liver function, were not systematically counted in any jurisdiction. No official was ever held legally accountable for the policy, and no court was ever required to rule on whether a government may lawfully poison citizens as a mechanism of law enforcement. The question was rendered moot by repeal and was permitted by the institutions that might have addressed it to remain precisely as unresolved as it had been on the day the first revised formula was signed. The same years that had treated the chemistry of what citizens drank as a legitimate domain for government intervention had also produced, in those same months and from a very different direction, an entirely separate category of poisoning, one conducted not in the shadows of a bootleg distillery or the corridors of a government bureau, but in the bright commercial light of pharmacies and department stores, advertised in national magazines and recommended, in a number of well-documented cases, by physicians who had every reason to believe that what they were prescribing was not merely harmless, but actively, measurably good for the body. The discovery of radium in 1898 by Marie and Pierre Curie in their Paris laboratory had produced, within the scientific world, a recognition that the physical universe operated according to principles considerably more complex than the preceding century had assumed. The Curies had isolated the element through a painstaking process of chemical separation from pitchblende, a uranium-bearing, or working in a converted shed on a Rue Lawman with equipment that was, by any standard measure, inadequate to the task, and at a cost to their own health that neither of them fully understood at the time. What they had found was an element that emitted radiation continuously, without any apparent external energy source, generating heat as though from some internal process that did not diminish in proportion to what it gave off. Marie Curie described the faint bluish-white luminescence of radium compounds stored in glass dishes in the darkened laboratory as beautiful, a word that appears in her private notebooks in a context entirely devoid of hyperbole, as a simple observation of what was visibly present. The element seemed, to those who encountered it in those early years, in some meaningful way alive. This impression that radium possessed a vital quality, a self-generating energy that might be transferred to human tissue through contact or ingestion, and might there perform some analogous revitalizing function, was not, in the early 1900s, confined to margins of medical or scientific thought. It circulated through professional journals and popular health publications with a frequency that lent it a degree of credibility, and it found in the general public a receptiveness that made considerable sense given the context. The preceding 50 years had produced germ theory, vaccination, anesthesia, antiseptic surgery, and the discovery of X-rays, each of which had revealed a layer of physical reality that had always been present but had only recently become intelligible. Radium, which was invisible to the eye except for its luminous compounds, which produced energy from within matter itself, and which had been discovered by a scientist who would hold 2 Nobel Prizes across 2 separate scientific disciplines, appeared to fit naturally within a pattern of discovery that had repeatedly demonstrated that the world was more complex and more manageable than it had previously seemed. The hypothesis that something so energetically active might also be therapeutically useful was not, in the intellectual climate of the 1910s and 1920s, on its face unreasonable. What grew from this impression, across the following 2 decades, was a commercial market of substantial scale and considerable ingenuity. Manufacturers in the United States and in several European countries began producing and marketing a wide range of consumer products whose principal selling point was the presence of radium or of radioactive compounds more broadly. Radither was a bottled tonic water produced by the Bailey Radium Laboratories of East Orange, New Jersey, that contained measured doses of radium-226 and radium-228, dissolved in distilled water and sealed in small glass bottles at retail price of $1 per bottle. The Revigator was a large ceramic crock lined with low-grade uranium ore, sold to households with the instruction that water stored overnight in the vessel would absorb a charge of radon by morning and should be consumed throughout the following day as a health tonic. The company claimed to have sold some 300,000 units by the mid-1920s. A German toothpaste called Doramad was marketed explicitly on the claim that radioactive thorium compounds strengthened tooth enamel and promoted healthy gum tissue, and was sold alongside ordinary dental preparations in pharmacies across Europe and through specialty importers in the United States. There were radium chocolates and radium hair tonics and radium face creams and radium bath salts, most of which contained either no actual radium at all or quantities so negligible as to be physically meaningless, though the marketing copy that surrounded them did not generally present this distinction with any clarity. The word radium, deployed across these product categories, functioned less as a statement of ingredient contents than as a positioning within the vocabulary of modern science, a signal to the purchasing public that what was in the package had the same general relationship to contemporary medicine as X-rays and vaccinations and everything else that the preceding decades had produced. William J. Bailey was among the more energetic entrepreneurs operating in this market. He worked under several company names from offices in New Jersey and New York, possessed no formal scientific credentials, and had previously been involved in legal difficulties connected to automobile patent dealings before directing his organizational energies toward the health product business. His principal product, Radither, was unusual within the radium health market in that it actually contained what its labeling claimed. Each bottle held 2 microcuries of radium in genuine and measurable quantities, rather than the trace or fictional amounts present in many competing preparations. Bailey marketed Radither under the phrase, "a cure for the living dead," and, in other promotional materials, as "perpetual sunshine," positioning it as a general tonic capable of addressing fatigue, impotence, digestive disorders, hypertension, and a range of chronic conditions for which conventional medicine offered no reliable remedy. He distributed Radithor through physicians, offering a commission on each bottle recommended and sold to patients, a practice that, when a doctor endorsed a product, lent the endorsement of clinical authority, which proved considerably more effective in motivating purchase than any advertising that Bailey might otherwise have placed. The case that would eventually draw the widest public attention to Radithor's consequences involved Eben McBurney Byers, a Pennsylvanian of considerable social standing. Byers had been a genuine athletic figure in his youth, winning the United States Amateur Golf Championship in 1906. He had graduated from Yale University and moved comfortably within the social circles of Pittsburgh and New York that appeared regularly in the society columns of daily newspapers. He encountered Radithor in 1927 after sustaining an arm injury on a train journey, and after physician acquaintance suggested the tonic might assist with his chronic discomfort. Byers found, or believed he found, that the product reduces pain and increases energy, and he began consuming it at a rate that exceeded the product's already generous recommended dose. Between 1927 and 1931, Byers consumed approximately 1,400 bottles of Radithor, a figure established subsequently through purchase records and the testimony of associates, and confirmed during the Federal Trade Commission's investigation into Bailey's operations. The radium contained in each of those bottles accumulated in the skeleton, following the calcium pathways of the body's mineral metabolism, because radium and calcium are chemically similar enough that the body's bone-building processes cannot reliably distinguish between them. The physical consequences of that accumulation were documented in clinical detail by the physicians who examined Byers through the final years of his life. The bones of his jaw began to deteriorate first, a process called osteonecrosis or radionecrosis, in which bone tissue dies from the effects of sustained radiation exposure, and that deterioration proceeded from localized areas of decay to a structural collapse of the facial skeleton that required surgeons to remove most of the jawbone. The damage extended progressively to the bones of the skull and cranium and to adjacent soft tissue, while the ongoing irradiation of his bone marrow suppressed production of the blood cells that the body requires for basic systemic function. He lost approximately 40 pounds over the period of his decline, and his height diminished measurably as vertebrae deteriorated. By 1931, Byers bore virtually no physical resemblance to the athletic young man who had competed in golf tournaments 25 years before. He died in April of 1931 at the age of 51. The Wall Street Journal published a report of his death under a headline that characterized the Radithor story in terms that were anomalous in the typically restrained prose of the financial press, and the coverage reached a readership considerably beyond those who normally follow discussions of patent medicines. The Federal Trade Commission had already begun investigating Bailey's operations before Byers died. The investigation intensified after his death, and Bailey was eventually required to cease manufacturing and selling Radithor. He died in 1949 of bladder cancer, one of the conditions that prolonged exposure to radioactive compounds has been established to cause. Bailey's customers were primarily those with the means to purchase health tonics at prices above the ordinary pharmaceutical market. The women who worked at the United States Radium Corporation's factory in Orange, New Jersey, encountered radium not as a consumer choice, but as an occupational material, and their exposure was not measured in bottles, but in years of daily, unprotected, and intimate contact. The company had been established in 1917 under the name the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation by a chemist of Austrian-Hungarian origin named Sabin von Sachiki, and it operated a facility that produced clock faces, instrument dials, watch faces, and military compass markings painted with a luminous compound called undark, a mixture of radium powder and a zinc sulfur preparation that glowed a persistent green in the absence of light. The factory employed several hundred workers, the great majority of them young women from the working-class neighborhoods of Orange and the surrounding Essex County communities, who were paid by the piece for each dial they completed and who worked at long wooden tables in rooms where the luminous dust settled across surfaces and clothing and skin in concentrations that were plainly visible under ordinary light. The technique the dial painters used to apply fine numerals on the small dial faces required precision that a flat brush could not easily achieve on its own. The supervisors of the factory instructed the workers to point the bristles of their brushes by drawing them across their lips and shaping the tip with the tongue before each application paint, a practice called lip pointing that was standard across the dial painting industry, and that was taught to new workers as a routine professional technique. Without any accompanying guidance about the radium content of the compound they were ingesting with each gesture. Workers also handled the luminous paint in conditions that settled it into their hair and onto their skin, and that coated the surfaces of the workroom in a persistent fine residue. Several women recalled in later accounts that they and their colleagues would sometimes apply the paint to their fingernails and faces before dances, to appear as luminous figures in the dark, because the effect was visually striking, and because no one had suggested to them that there was any reason to avoid it. The factory's chemists and physicists handled radium compounds with lead shielding and long-handled tools. The dial painters received no equivalent precaution. By the early 1920s, workers at the Orange factory began presenting at physicians' offices and dental surgeries with symptoms that would come to be recognized over the following years as a characteristic pattern of radiation-induced bone destruction. The jaw was the site of initial presentation. Persistent pain, loosening of teeth, infections that would not resolve, and then the beginning of structural collapse in the bone itself, with tissue dying and bone fragmenting in a progression that the physicians who first encountered it attributed to phosphorus poisoning, a known occupational hazard of certain industrial processes involving that element. The pattern, however, was inconsistent with phosphorus in certain diagnostic details, and as more women from the same workplace presented with the same constellation of findings, the clinical picture began to cohere around a different cause. Grace Fryer, who had worked at the Orange factory beginning in 1917, started experiencing severe jaw deterioration and pain in her joints in the early 1920s. Catherine Schaub, Keenda McDonald, Albina Laris, and Edna Hussman, all former dial painters from the same facility, were found to be experiencing similar and similarly progressive conditions. Laboratory analysis of bone tissue confirmed the presence of elevated radium concentrations consistent with years of occupational ingestion as the source of their destruction. The legal course the 5 women pursued was impeded by obstacles that reflected both the novelty of their claim and the capacity of a well-resourced corporation to contest it. They filed suit against the United States Radium Corporation in 1927, arguing that the company had knowingly exposed them to a substance whose dangers it had understood and had withheld from its workforce. The company's legal strategy included disputing the medical evidence connecting their symptoms to radium specifically, raising the argument that New Jersey's applicable statute of limitations had already expired, and challenging the causal chain that the women's physicians had documented. New Jersey law at the time required a legal action to be brought within 2 years of the day of injury, but the women's injuries had manifested and progressed so slowly, and their understanding of the cause had come so gradually and so late, that a strict application of the rule would have extinguished their claim before it could be heard. A New Jersey equity court allowed the case to proceed on grounds that strict application of the statute would produce a result contrary to justice, a ruling that was itself a significant procedural development. The case received sustained coverage in national newspapers, partly because the 5 women were visibly and severely ill and testified or appeared in court in conditions that made the nature of their suffering concrete and undeniable. A settlement was reached in 1928, before the matter went to a jury. Each of the 5 women received a lump sum payment of $10,000, an annual pension of $600 for the duration of their lives, and the payment of their ongoing medical expenses by the corporation. In the narrow legal sense, this was a resolution. The radium already fixed in their bones, however, continued to irradiate the surrounding tissue with the indifference characteristic of radioactive decay, which proceeds according to its own timescale regardless of what has been signed in the courtroom. Grace Fryer died in 1933, 5 years after the settlement. Catherine Schaub died the same year. Sabin von Sachiki, the company's founder, had died in November of 1928 of aplastic anemia, a blood condition associated with prolonged radiation exposure. Months before the settlement, he had helped create the conditions for what was finalized. The legal legacy of the case proved more durable than the lives of those who had brought it. The precedent it established for recognizing occupational disease as a basis for employer liability influenced the handling of similar claims in subsequent decades, including cases involving silica dust and asbestos, and contributed to the developing body of American labor law that placed affirmative obligations on employers regarding the known hazards of their workplaces. More immediately, The case and the contemporaneous documentation of what had happened to Eben Byers and others who had consumed commercial radium products generated a level of public scrutiny that the Federal Trade Commission and, gradually, the Food and Drug Administration began to apply to the radioactive health product market in a way they had not been moved to apply before. The commercial radium health industry contracted through the late 1920s and into the 1930s. Under combined pressure of regulatory attention and a newspaper record of consequences that had become difficult for the ordinary reader to reconcile with the language of vitality and perpetual sunshine that the products had used to market themselves. Marie Curie, who had spent decades handling radioactive materials under conditions of minimal protective precaution, was diagnosed with aplastic anemia in her final years and died in July of 1934. Her personal notebooks from the 1890s remain radioactive and are stored in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Researchers who wish to examine the original documents are required to sign a waiver acknowledging the associated risk. She had not, in her public statements, endorsed the commercial health market that grew from her discoveries or characterized radium as a therapeutic substance, but the cultural mythology that had accumulated around her work and around the element she named proved resistant to the more measured assessments that the scientific record of the 1920s was beginning to produce. What had been, for nearly 2 decades, a set of ordinary commercial transactions, the purchase of tonic water, the painting of watch dials, the application of luminous face powder, was revealed through the accumulated evidence of medical examinations and courtroom testimony and mortality records to have been an encounter with a form of harm that the period's commercial frameworks had been entirely unprepared to anticipate or prevent. The same unwillingness to look carefully at the composition of what was being sold and applied and consumed had, in those same years, sustained another category of harm that was conducted not in pharmacies or factory workrooms, but in the narrow spaces of coal breaker houses and cotton mills, by hands that were considerably smaller than those of the adults who had built those industries and who had, over time, come to depend upon them. The federal census of 1920 recorded approximately 1,060,000 children between the ages of 10 and 15 who were classified as gainfully employed within American industry, agriculture, and commerce, a figure that represented a meaningful decline from the 1,750,000 recorded in 1900, and that was offered in certain quarters as evidence that the country was moving in the right direction. Whether those census figures fully captured the actual scale of the phenomenon was itself a matter of contemporary dispute among researchers and social welfare advocates. Children working in agriculture, in domestic service, and in small family-operated businesses were systematically undercounted in census classifications that had been designed primarily to record factory and mine employment, and organizations devoted to reforming child labor practices consistently argued that the true total was considerably higher than what the official record showed. What the census did capture, with a clarity that required no interpretation, was that more than 1 million children of school age were working in conditions that bore no resemblance to school hours and domestic routine that child welfare advocates of the period were beginning to argue constituted a reasonable and appropriate childhood. That 1 million children was not a remnant of an earlier era being slowly resolved. It was the ongoing, ordinary state of things. The industries that employed the largest concentrations of children were geographically specific in ways that reflected the regional distribution of particular kinds of manufacturing and extraction. The cotton textile mills of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama represented one of the largest single concentrations of child labor in the country, employing children as young as 8 and 9 in the roles of spinner, doffer, and sweeper. Positions that required small hands and bodies capable of moving to the frames and between equipment in spaces that adult frames could not comfortably navigate. The coal-breaking operations of Pennsylvania and West Virginia employed boys. The work was almost exclusively male. In the breaker houses sitting at the surface of mines, where raw coal coming up from underground was sorted by hand to separate usable anthracite from the slate, pyrite, and waste rock embedded throughout it. The glass bottle factories of Indiana and Ohio, the shrimp and oyster canneries of Louisiana and Maryland, and the beet sugar fields of Colorado and Michigan also drew heavily on child workers, for reasons related to the specific physical requirements of the work, to the wage advantages of employing children at rates below those of adult workers, and to the absence in many of these industries in the states where they operated, of any law that prohibited the practice. The breaker boys of the Pennsylvania anthracite fields were perhaps the most photographed and most written about child workers in the reform literature of the period, and the conditions under which they worked had earned that attention in detail. The breaker house was a large wooden structure positioned above the mine shaft opening, through which coal was conveyed by mechanical chutes from the underground workings to elevated sorting platforms inside the building. Boys sat astride or beside the moving chutes, picking out by hand the pieces of slate and rock that passed through, a task requiring sustained attention, and producing, in hands performing it over weeks and months, a characteristic pattern of cuts from sharp coal and slate edges, and a permanent darkening of the skin, where coal dust settled into small wounds and was never fully removed. The noise inside a working breaker house was considerable. The mechanical conveyors, the coal striking metal and with surfaces, the separation screens vibrating under load, all sustained across a working day that typically ran 10 hours in the 1920s, and that had run 12 hours or more in the decades before state laws imposing hour limits had taken partial hold. The dust was pervasive and fine, settling into the respiratory tract in a way that anthracite dust always does in those who breathe it over time, depositing in the small airways and alveoli in concentrations that would accumulate across years of exposure into a condition later generations would classify as coal workers' pneumoconiosis. Boys working in the breakers were often as young as 8 or 9 when they began, though the formal minimum age requirements in Pennsylvania, which vary between 8 and 12 depending on the period and the precise category of employment, were enforced with flexibility that the employment records of the time reflect plainly. Foremen asked about the ages of very young workers were known to accept a parent's word without documentation, or to record whatever age allowed the employment to proceed. Some families provided written statements attesting to ages clearly inconsistent with the child's physical development, in circumstances where the family's economic position made the child's wages a practical necessity rather than a supplemental convenience. The wages paid to breaker boys were typically between $1 and $1.40 per day for a 10-hour shift, a sum that was meaningful in households where adult male wages in the underground mines ran from $1.50 to $2.50, and where a family of 6 or 8 or 10 required every available source of income to maintain any margin above subsistence. The cotton mill children of the Carolinas and Georgia worked in conditions with their own particular character. The spinning rooms of mills like the Loray Mill in Gastonia, North Carolina, or the Eagle and Phoenix Mills in Columbus, Georgia, were large, high-ceiling spaces filled with row after row of spinning frames, machinery transforming cotton fiber into thread under mechanical tension, requiring constant monitoring and management of breakages. Spinner boys and doffer boys, doffers being those who replaced full bobbins with empty ones as the frames ran continuously, move along the rows in work that was physically demanding and perform in air that was warm and dense with cotton lint. The lint was not considered, within the mill culture of the period, as a serious occupational hazard. It was simply what the air in a cotton mill contained, in the way that noise was simply what a cotton mill sounded like. The long-term respiratory consequences of sustained cotton dust inhalation, a condition eventually recognized clinically as bisonosis, characterized by progressive airway constriction and chest tightening, were entirely absent from the working vocabulary of mill management or the physicians practicing in mill-dependent communities through the 1920s, and the workers who would experience its effects in later life had no framework within which to anticipate them. Children working in glass factories faced a different set of physical conditions from those in mines and textile mills, though no less consequential ones. The glass industry concentrated around Muncie and Marion and Kokomo in Indiana employed boys as young as 10 and 11 in roles requiring them to carry molten glass on iron rods from furnaces maintained at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, working in the radiant heat of furnace rooms for shifts that frequently ran through the night. The night shift was characteristic of the glass industry because furnaces operated continuously and could not be economically shut down between production cycles, and children were often assigned to overnight hours on the grounds that they were cheaper to employ and less likely than adult workers to resist the assignment or demand additional compensation for it. The combination of intense sustained heat disrupted sleep across months and years of night employment, and the immediate physical hazards of handling molten material under conditions of exhaustion represented a set of stresses on developing bodies that the scientific literature of the period had not systematically addressed, and that the glass industry had no institutional incentive to investigate. The man most responsible for making the visual reality of child labor concrete and specific to a national audience was Louis Hine, a sociologist and photographer who had trained as a teacher in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and who had begun working on behalf of the National Child Labor Committee in 1908. Hine spent the following decade traveling across the country with a large format camera, documenting the workers he encountered through a method that was systematic and deliberate. He recorded not merely images, but names, ages, heights, and specific circumstances of each child's employment. Information he gathered through direct conversation with the children and their supervisors, and that he annotated in field notebooks kept alongside the negatives. He photographed Sadie Pfeiffer in a Lancaster, South Carolina, cotton mill in 1908, noted her age as 10, and recording her height relative to machinery she tended. The proportional relationship between child and equipment visible in the image in a way that required no explanatory caption. He photographed the oyster shuckers of Biloxi, Mississippi, where children as young as 5 and 6 stood at the shucking tables alongside their mothers in the pre-dawn cold of the cannery floor. He documented the tobacco strippers of Central Virginia, the breaker boys of the Scranton and Wilkes-Barre districts, the midnight glass workers of Indiana, and the beet field laborers of Colorado, building over. A decade in archive that constituted the most extensive documentary record of American child labor ever assembled by a single practitioner. The National Child Labor Committee, which had employed Hine and circulated his photographs through exhibitions, publications, lantern slide presentations in churches and settlement houses, and reports distributed to legislators, had been founded in 1904 in New York City by a coalition of settlement house workers, social reformers, and academics concerned with the welfare of children in industrial employment. Florence Kelley, the General Secretary of the National Consumers League, and among the most effective social reform advocates working in the United States at the turn of the century, was among its earliest and most consistently active members. Edgar Gardner Murphy, an Episcopal clergyman from Montgomery, Alabama, who had spent the late 1890s documenting conditions in the southern textile mills and lobbying the Alabama legislature for reform, brought to the committee a first-hand understanding of conditions in the industries it was challenging and a strategic sense of what was politically feasible in states where the mill owners held substantial legislative influence. Owen Lovejoy served as the committee's general secretary through much of its most active legislative period, overseeing the organization's efforts in Washington and the states with the patience that the nature of the work demanded. The campaign for federal legislation proceeded through a series of attempts that reflected, with unusual clarity, the constitutional difficulty of asserting federal authority over conditions that the dominant legal interpretation of the period placed within state jurisdiction. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana had introduced an early federal child labor bill in 1906, arguing on the Senate floor that the Commerce Clause of the Constitution gave Congress the authority to regulate the interstate shipment of goods produced by child labor. The bill did not pass, but the constitutional argument it rested on became the foundation for the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act of 1916, which prohibited the interstate shipment of goods produced in factories employing children under 14, or employing children between 14 and 16 for more than 8 hours per day, more than 6 days per week, or during the hours between 7 in the evening and 6 in the morning. President Woodrow Wilson signed the act into law in September of 1916, and for the first time a federal standard governing the conditions of child labor had survived the legislative process and reached the statute books. The Keating-Owen Act remained in effect for less than 2 years before the Supreme Court addressed its constitutionality. In Hammer v. Dagenhart, decided in June of 1918, a 5-4 majority of the court held that Congress had exceeded its authority under the Commerce Clause. Justice William Rufus Day, writing for the majority, drew a distinction between goods that were in themselves harmful or immoral. Lottery tickets, impure food, women transported across state line for immoral purposes, whose interstate shipment Congress could legitimately regulate, and goods that were harmless in themselves but had been produced through labor practices Congress wished to discourage. Child labor, in Day's formulation, was a matter of local manufacturing conditions, and the power to regulate those conditions was reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment. The four dissenting justices, led by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, argued that the majority had invented a distinction without a constitutional basis, but the dissent did not carry. The act was struck down, and the practical situation in the mills and mines reverted to what the individual state laws allowed. Congress turned to a second constitutional mechanism with the Revenue Act of 1919, which imposed a tax of 10% on the net profits of any mine or factory employing children in violation of the age and hours standards that Keating-Owen had established. The theory underlying this approach was that Congress's taxing power, which the courts had interpreted more broadly than its commerce power, might accomplish through fiscal pressure what the Commerce Clause approach had not been permitted to accomplish through direct prohibition. The Supreme Court resolved this question in Bailey v. Drexel Furniture Company in 1922, ruling 8-1 that the child labor tax was not a legitimate exercise of the taxing power, but a regulatory penalty used in the form of taxation without its substance, and therefore no more within congressional authority than the commerce-based approach that Hammer v. Dagenhart had already invalidated. Chief Justice William Howard Taft, writing for the majority, held that the level of the penalty and the specificity of its conditions demonstrated that Congress was attempting to regulate, not to raise revenue, and that this distinction was constitutionally determinative. The response among reform organizations was to pursue an amendment to the Constitution itself. Congress passed the Child Labor Amendment in June of 1924, sending it to the states for ratification. The amendment would have granted Congress explicit authority to regulate and prohibit the labor of persons under 18 years of age, removing the constitutional constraints that had invalidated the two preceding statutes. 28 states ratified it within the first several years. The remaining states, including a number of southern states where the textile industry wielded substantial legislative influence, agricultural states whose farm economies depended partly on seasonal child labor, and states where the amendment had been characterized by opponents as a federal intrusion into family life, did not. The amendment required ratification by 3/4 of the states, which in 1924 meant 36 of the 48 states then in the Union, and it never reached that threshold. The patchwork of state laws that governed child labor through the 1920s reflected both the range of political pressures bearing on individual state legislatures and the economic interests of the industries concentrated in each state. Massachusetts and New York had enacted relatively restrictive laws by the early years of the century, establishing minimum employment ages of 14 for most factory work, requiring employers to obtain age certificates and maintain employment records, and providing for enforcement mechanisms that, while imperfect, gave the laws some practical weight. Georgia and North Carolina had minimum age requirements for certain manufacturing categories, but maintained broad exemptions for industries central to their regional economies, and both permitted exceptions in cases where the child was documented as the financial support of a widowed mother, a provision that could be applied with considerable latitude in communities where mill employment represented the primary economic activity. Agricultural work was exempted from child labor restrictions in virtually every state's legislative framework, which meant that the children working in the sugar beet fields of Colorado and Michigan and the vegetable fields of New Jersey and Delaware, frequently the children of immigrant families moving seasonally across state lines, had no legal protection from any jurisdiction through which they passed. Lewis Hine had left the National Child Labor Committee in 1918, having completed the documentary project for which it had employed him over a decade. The children he had photographed through those years, the breaker boys of Scranton, the spinner girls of Lancaster, the oyster shuckers of Biloxi, had, by the 1920s, grown into adults who carried in their bodies whatever the years of industrial childhood had left in them: the lung conditions, the joint damage, the scarring from machinery contact, and the educational deficits produced by years of 10-hour working days in spaces that were not schools. The photographs Hine had made of them are held primarily in the collection of the Library of Congress, where they were later digitized and made available as part of the historical record of what ordinary working life in the country's industries had looked like in those years. They are precise documents, carefully annotated, and they constitute a form of testimony that no subsequent revisionist account of the period has been able to set aside. The federal legislation that finally accomplished what Keating-Owen and the Drexel Tax and the Constitutional Amendment had each attempted was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established federal minimum wage, maximum hour, and child labor standards for industries engaged in interstate commerce. The Supreme Court upheld the act unanimously in United States versus Darby Lumber Company in 1941, explicitly overruling Hammer versus Dagenhart in language that treated Justice Day's 1918 reasoning as having been incorrect from the outset. The path from a National Child Labor Committee's founding in 1904 to effective federal legislation in 1938 had taken 34 years. The failure of two statutes, the non-ratification of a constitutional amendment, and a political realignment of sufficient magnitude to produce a judiciary willing to read the Commerce Clause as it had not previously been read. During those 34 years, the mills and mines and canneries and beet fields had continued to operate under whatever the applicable state law permitted, and the children within them had continued to work. The industries that sustained themselves on child labor had relied, for much of the preceding half-century, on the argument that the work was neither unusual nor harmful, that it was an extension of the domestic economy into the industrial setting, appropriate to the circumstances of working-class family life, and that the objections raised against it reflected an imposition of reformist values upon communities whose needs and traditions differed from those of the reformers. That argument had enough internal consistency to sustain itself through decades of legislative hearings and newspaper debates, even as the photographic record, the injury statistics, and the medical literature compiled by those who would look most carefully at the specific conditions of child industrial labor pointed steadily in a different direction. The argument proved, in the end, less durable than the evidence, though the evidence had required a very long time to accumulate sufficient institutional weight to act upon. What had been true of the factory floors and the coal breakers was true, in its own way, of the cosmetic counter and the pharmacy shelf of the same decade, that the absence of scrutiny was itself a kind of permission, one that the market had used a thoroughness that the people most directly affected by its consequences had not been in any position to anticipate. The 1920s were, by most commercial measures, a decade of remarkable growth for the American cosmetics industry. The combination of factors driving that growth included the expansion of electric lighting in domestic and retail settings, which made both the purchase and the application of cosmetic products a more practically manageable activity than it had been under gas or oil illumination. The rise of cinema as a mass entertainment form whose female stars appeared on screen in makeup calibrated to particular demands of early film photography, and a broader cultural shift in dominant attitudes toward feminine appearance that had begun in the years around the First World War, and that continued through the 1920s with gathering commercial momentum. Women who would not have applied cosmetics in any public-facing capacity before the war were using them in increasing numbers by the mid-1920s, and the industry supplying them had responded with proliferation of products, lipsticks, mascaras, face powders, rouge, eyebrow pencils, skin creams, and depilatory preparations that filled pharmacy shelves and department store counters in varieties and price points designed to reach consumers across a wide range of economic circumstances. The revenue generated by the industry's expansion was substantial. Cosmetic sales in the United States were estimated at approximately $300 million annually by the mid-1920s, a figure that would grow steadily through the end of the decade. The regulatory framework governing what those products contained was not commensurate with the scale of the industry that had grown up around them. The Pure Food and Drug Act, passed in 1906 following the sustained advocacy of Harvey Washington Wiley, the chief chemist of the United States Department of Agriculture, had established federal oversight of food products and patent medicines, requiring that adulterated or misbranded goods be kept from interstate commerce and that certain categories of dangerous ingredients be disclosed on labeling. Wiley had spent the better part of 2 decades documenting the adulterants present in the American food supply. The formaldehyde used to extend the shelf life of milk, the copper sulfate added to canned vegetables to maintain their color, the coal tar dyes present in candies and bottled beverages. And his advocacy had produced legislation that was, within its defined scope, a genuine improvement over what had preceded it, what the 1906 Act did not address, and what its drafters had not specifically considered, was the cosmetics industry. A lipstick was not a food. A face cream was not a drug, provided its manufacturers did not make specific medical claims in their advertising. A depilatory preparation applied to the skin was not, under the legal classifications that the Act established, within the regulatory boundary the Act had drawn. Cosmetic products could be manufactured with any ingredient, in any concentration, without any federal requirement that those ingredients be tested for safety before formulation, disclosed on the product's packaging, or reviewed and approved by any government body before the product was offered for sale. This regulatory absence was not, in the early 1920s, widely understood by the purchasing public. The assumption that products sold commercially by established manufacturers and available in mainstream pharmacies and department stores were safe for their stated purpose was a reasonable working assumption for a consumer making routine purchases. And it was an assumption that the cosmetics industry, whose advertising consistently employed the language of modern chemistry and the endorsements of dermatologists and scientific laboratories, had substantial commercial incentive to reinforce and sustain. The question of whether that assumption was justified for any specific product required access to chemical analysis, to medical case literature, and to the kind of institutional scrutiny that the federal government had not yet been authorized to apply. In the absence of that scrutiny, the market proceeded on its own terms. Lead was among the oldest and most persistently used ingredients in Western cosmetic formulations, with a history traceable from the white lead face preparations of ancient Rome and the court complexion powders of Elizabethan England through to the Victorian era's range of skin preparations that incorporated lead carbonate as a whitening agent. Laird's Bloom of Youth, a liquid complexion preparation that had been manufactured and sold in the United States since the 1860s, contained lead acetate and lead carbonate in its formulation, the same compounds that have been associated in the medical literature with lead poisoning for the better part of 2 centuries. And it continued to be produced and distributed through pharmacy catalogs and mail-order retail well into the 1920s. The product's advertising made no reference to its metallic content, and there was no legal requirement that it should. The physiological effects of chronic lead exposure, its accumulation in bone and soft tissue over months and years of daily topical application, its well-documented impacts on the neurological system and the kidneys, and its particular harm to fetal development in pregnant women, were established in the scientific literature by the 1920s with a clarity that left no serious professional disagreement. They were simply not information that the regulatory framework required to be communicated to the consumer, and they were not information that consumers had reliable means of independently discovering at the cosmetic counter. Arsenic had a similarly long history in the cosmetic pharmacopoeia, and it found its way into the 1920s beauty market through a category of product known variously as complexion wafers, skin tablets, or arsenic pills, preparations marketed on the proposition that small oral doses of arsenic, carefully calibrated, would produce a pale and clear complexion by affecting the distribution of blood to the skin surface and by acting on the pigmentation processes of the dermis. The commercial claim had roots in observations about the populations of certain regions in the Austrian Tyrol and in Styria, where a documented cultural practice of arsenic ingestion among some rural communities had been noted by traveling physicians of the 19th century, who observed that those communities appear to have a notably pale complexion. The inference that the arsenic itself was responsible for the cosmetic effect and that the practice could be safely adopted for beauty purposes was not medically sound, but it had the structure of a claim resting on field observation, which gave it more credibility in popular health literature than a wholly invented proposition would have commanded. Fowler's solution, a preparation containing 1% potassium arsenite that had been used in medicine since the 18th century as a treatment for various chronic conditions, was available through pharmacies in the 1920s in formulations explicitly positioned for cosmetic rather than therapeutic use. Mercury-based skin preparations occupied a third category of toxic cosmetic product in common use during the period. Ammoniated mercury had been present in skin lightening and bleaching creams since the mid-19th century, and it remained in a range of products sold through the 1920s under trade names that gave no indication of the compounds they contained. Mercury is absorbed through the skin into the systemic circulation, where it accumulates preferentially in the kidneys and the peripheral nervous system. Chronic low-level mercury exposure produces a characteristic pattern of symptoms: neurological irritability, tremor, insomnia, and in sustained cases progressive cognitive impairment, that had been recognized as an occupational disease in hatters and felt workers exposed to mercury nitrate used in industrial processing since at least the early 19th century, and whose association with that trade had entered common idiom through the phrase associated with the profession. In the context of cosmetic use, where the exposure was daily but at lower concentrations than those found in industrial settings, the neurological effects were difficult to distinguish from other causes, and a physician consulted about such symptoms in the 1920s was not likely, in the ordinary course of practice, to trace them back to the skin cream on the patient's dressing table. Thallium entered the cosmetic market not through a long historical precedent, but as the active ingredient in a depilatory preparation that was, at the time of its introduction, genuinely effective at the specific task it had been designed to accomplish. Coremlu cream was manufactured and marketed in the United States in the late 1920s as a product capable of providing permanent or long-lasting hair removal in a market where conventional alternatives, shaving, waxing, and abrasive preparations, offer results that were temporary and frequently irritating to the skin. The active compound in Coremlu was thallium acetate, a salt of thallium, a heavy metal identified in the mid-19th century by the British chemist William Crookes and subsequently used in small quantities in certain optical glass formulations and as a rodenticide. Thallium disrupts the body's potassium ion transport systems at the cellular level, interferes with mitochondrial energy production, and produces characteristic damage to the peripheral nervous system, whose signature is a progressive ascending weakness, beginning in the extremities and moving toward the trunk. Among its distinctive acute effects is a generalized loss of hair from across the entire body, a useful property in a product designed for hair removal, but produced without respect for the user's wishes regarding which hair should go, and accompanied by the neurological consequences that made it an indiscriminate rather than a targeted compound. The clinical cases of Coremlu-related harm that came to medical attention in the late 1920s and early 1930s followed a consistent pattern. Initial satisfaction with the product's depilatory effect, followed by hair loss extending well beyond the treated areas, then the onset of progressive neurological symptoms, including weakness and pain in the limbs, disturbances of vision and coordination, and in the most severe cases lasting neurological damage amounting to partial paralysis. A review published in the Journal of the American Medical Association identified more than 100 patients who had experienced significant systemic effects from thallium poisoning following the use of Coremlu, among them several who had sustained paralysis from which they had not recovered at the time of the review's publication. The product was eventually withdrawn from the market, but the mechanism of that withdrawal was not a federal safety determination. It was the accumulated weight of medical case reports and the resulting legal exposure to the company's continued operation. There was no federal authority with the power to test the product before it reached pharmacy shelves, and no requirement that the manufacturer demonstrate its safety before placing on sale. The mascara that injured the largest number of documented users in this period was a product called Lash Lure, an eyelash and eyebrow dye sold in beauty parlors beginning in the late 1920s. Lash Lure contained paraphenylenediamine, an industrial dye compound used in textile processing and in the formulation of permanent hair color products, which have been noted in European medical literature as a chemical sensitizer, a compound capable of inducing allergic reactions in a proportion of those exposed to it, with subsequent reactions typically increasing in severity rather than diminishing with repeated contact. Applied to the eyelid and the skin immediately surrounding the eye, paraphenylenediamine produced in susceptible individuals a range of reactions extending from local inflammation and swelling to ulceration of the corneal surface, with the most severe cases resulting in scarring sufficient to cause permanent impairment or total loss of vision. One woman died following a severe systemic allergic reaction to Lash Lure in 1933. A later review conducted in connection with a federal legislative campaign to reform cosmetics regulation identified approximately 16 women who had been blinded by the product, and a larger number who had sustained permanent but less complete eye injuries. Lash Lure was sold legally through legitimate beauty establishments because there was no law requiring that it be tested, no authority empowered to evaluate its safety before distribution, and no labeling requirement that might have conveyed any warning to the consumer. The official who assembled the most comprehensive public accounting of what the regulatory gap had produced was Ruth DeForest Lamb, who served as Chief Educational Officer of the Food and Drug Administration in the early 1930s. Lamb was a writer and public health communicator by training, and she brought to her position a concern for translating the technical findings of agency investigators into terms accessible to a general public and to the congressional audience whose support was needed to expand the FDA's authority. Drawing on case files that agency staff and cooperating physicians had compiled, Lamb assembled a traveling exhibition of cosmetics, patent medicines, and food products whose injurious effects were documented through medical photographs, clinical records, and the physical evidence of the damage they had caused. The exhibition became known informally among Washington observers as the American Chamber of Horrors, a display that placed the products themselves, with their commercial packaging and their advertising claims, alongside the documented consequences of their use. Eleanor Roosevelt, who viewed the exhibition at a Washington showing, described it in subsequent correspondence as among the most persuasive arguments for legislative action she had encountered in her public life. Lamb subsequently wrote a book drawing on the same material, published in 1936 under the title American Chamber of Horrors, The Truth About Food and Drugs, which extended the reach of the exhibition's documentation to a readership beyond Washington. The senator most closely associated with the legislative campaign to reform the 1906 Act and extend its scope to cosmetics was Royal Copeland of New York, a physician and former New York City Health Commissioner who had been elected to the Senate in 1922 and who introduced the first version of what would become the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1933. The bill faced sustained opposition from cosmetics and food manufacturers, who objected to the proposed requirement that companies demonstrate the safety of their products before bringing them to market, and from legislators who characterized the proposed expansion of federal authority as an overreach into commercial activity that the existing framework had not claimed. Copeland's bill was introduced, revised, and reintroduced across 5 sessions of Congress, acquiring amendments and compromises at each stage, and the political conditions for its final passage were not created by any finding about cosmetics specifically, but by a sulfanilamide antibiotic disaster in 1937, in which a solvent component of a liquid medication proved acutely toxic and killed approximately 107 people, most of them children, across the country's southern states, an event that demonstrated, with a concreteness that no exhibition or book had been able to fully provide, the consequences of a regulatory system that still did not require manufacturers to test their product for safety before offering them for sale. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, signed into law in June of that year, extended federal regulatory oversight explicitly to cosmetics for the first time in American legislative history. Walter Campbell, who had served as the FDA's chief administrator through the legislative campaign and who had supported Lamb's exhibition and the broader public information effort, described the act at its passage as a beginning rather than a resolution, an assessment that reflected his understanding that the regulatory authority the law established, while meaningful, would require substantial further development before it matched the variety and scale of the industry it was designed to govern. Harvey Washington Wiley, whose advocacy had produced the 1906 Act, had died in 1930. 8 years before the reform, he had spent the later part of his career arguing for was enacted. He had characterized the cosmetics gap in his writings as a significant and ongoing source of preventable harm, and he had understood the dynamics that sustained it. The resistance of commercial interests, the difficulty of maintaining public attention on injuries that accumulated gradually and invisibly, and the constitutional constraints on federal authority that narrowed the legislative options available to reformers, with a precision that described the same dynamics that would slow the reform campaign through the following 3 decades. The women who had purchased Lash Lure at a beauty parlor, or ordered Laird's Bloom of Youth from a mail-order catalog, or applied a thallium depilatory cream bought from a pharmacy shelf, had done so in a reasonable belief that product available through those commercial channels had been considered safe by some authority capable of making that evaluation. The belief was not unreasonable. It was in the regulatory environment of the 1920s, simply incorrect. And the institutions that might have corrected it had not yet been given the authority, or in some cases the inclination, to do so. The same period that had sustained the particular failures of regulatory attention had also been producing, in a very different register and through very different institutions, a body of thought and organized practice that appeared to its proponents not as a regulatory failure, but as a regulatory achievement, a program of scientific planning, state authority, and academic legitimacy applied to questions of human inheritance and the composition of the population itself, which had attracted, by the mid-1920s, the endorsement of major universities, the financial support of prominent philanthropic foundations, and the considered approval of the Supreme Court of the United States. The word eugenics had been coined by the British scientist Francis Galton in 1883, derived from the Greek roots for well-born, as a name for what Galton described as the science of improving the hereditary qualities of the human race through deliberate selective practice. Galton was a polymath of genuinely wide-ranging intellectual energies, a geographer, a statistician, a meteorologist, and a pioneer of fingerprint classification methods, and he brought to the subject of human heredity the same quantitative orientation he applied to every other domain he investigated. His core proposition was that the personal qualities that made an individual more or less capable of contributing to civilized society, intelligence, moral character, industriousness, physical health, were substantially heritable, and that the human species could therefore be improved by the same selective pressures that animal breeders applied to livestock, encouraging reproduction among those who exhibited desirable traits, and discouraging or preventing it among those who did not. Galton did not, in his published writings, advocate for compulsory sterilization of the latter category. His preferred mechanisms were social encouragement and financial incentive for those he considered well-suited to reproduce. The structural logic of his proposition, however, contained within it a coercive implication that his successors in the following decades were considerably less reluctant to make explicit. The intellectual migration of eugenics from British scientific circles to the American Academy occurred over the final years of the 19th century and the opening decade of the 20th. Carried along by the general prestige of Darwinian evolutionary thinking and by the particular anxieties that mass immigration was generating among the native-born professional classes of American cities. The figure most responsible for establishing eugenics as an organized institutional enterprise in the United States was Charles Benedict Davenport, a biologist trained at Harvard University who had conducted research in experimental zoology before directing his attention to the study of human heredity. In 1910, Davenport established the eugenics record office on a property at Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, with financial support from the Carnegie Institution of Washington and from Mary Harriman, the widow of the railway magnate Edward Henry Harriman, whose family contributed substantial funding to the office's operations in its founding years, and whose land at Cold Spring Harbor provided the physical site on which the institution was built. The combination of philanthropic funding, academic affiliation, and a purpose-built physical facility gave the Eugenics Record Office a structural legitimacy that earlier, less organized expressions of eugenic thinking in America had lacked, and allowed Davenport to build, over the following decade, what became the largest single center for eugenics research and advocacy in the world. The methodology the office developed drew on the rediscovered principles of Mendelian genetics. Gregor Mendel's 19th century work on the inheritance of traits in peas had been largely overlooked until its independent rediscovery around 1900 by several European botanists to construct a framework in which complex human characteristics were treated as heritable in patterns analogous to the dominant and recessive traits that Mendel had documented in plants. The office trained field workers, primarily women with recent degrees from American colleges in biology or social work, in a research method that required traveling to the homes of families in rural communities and to state institutions housing individuals classified as mentally deficient or socially deviant, conducting interviews across multiple generations of the same family, and constructing pedigree charts that recorded the presence of designated traits through the family tree and graphic form. The traits being tracked and classified included not only conditions with genuine biological components, Huntington's chorea, certain hereditary forms of blindness, but also categories whose definition the office's own publications did not treat as problematic: feeble-mindedness, pauperism, criminality, shiftlessness, sexual immorality, and what the classification system labeled moral defect. These were recorded in the pedigree charts and in the research publications the office produced as heritable conditions in the same technical sense as a recognized genetic disorder, the product of specific hereditary determinants passing from parents to children across generations in Mendelian ratios. The scientific problems with this approach were not entirely invisible to all the researchers who encountered the office's work, but in the 1910s and through most of the 1920s, they were insufficiently organized and insufficiently prominent to limit the institutional momentum the eugenics enterprise had by then developed. The fundamental difficulty was that the traits being tracked were inseparable from the social conditions in which they were observed. A family classified as exhibiting pauperism across multiple generations was, In almost all documented cases, a family that had been poor across multiple generations, and the causes of persistent poverty, limited access to formal education, geographic isolation, restricted economic opportunity, ethnic or racial discrimination in the labor market. The cumulative health consequences of inadequate nutrition and deficient housing were not accessible to the pedigree chart methodology and were not incorporated into the analytical framework that the field workers had been trained to apply. When a field worker visited a rural family in a state institution and found multiple members across multiple generations who appeared to exhibit limited intellectual function, the framework directed her toward a genetic explanation rather than toward the nutritional deficiencies, exposure to environmental toxins, untreated disease, or simply the limited educational provision that the communities and institutions in which those families had spent their lives might have produced. The framework was not designed to ask those alternative questions, and most of the time it did not ask them. Harry Hamilton Laughlin was appointed superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office in 1910 and became, over the following 2 decades, the most administratively consequential figure in the American eugenics movement, the person most directly responsible for translating eugenic theory into legislative policy at the state and federal level. Laughlin was not a scientist of significant original contribution. His professional strength lay in institutional and political work, in the capacity to present contested technical claims with the confidence of established fact before congressional committees, state legislative hearings, and academic conferences where policy was shaped. In 1922, Laughlin published what he called the Model Eugenical Sterilization Law, a template piece of legislation providing states with a constitutionally and administratively workable framework for enacting compulsory sterilization programs. The model law recommended the compulsory sterilization of individuals falling within 10 designated categories of social inadequacy: the feeble-minded, the insane, the criminalistic, the epileptic, the inebriate, the diseased, the blind, the deaf, the deformed, and the dependent. The last category encompassing, in the law's specific language, orphans, ne'er-do-wells, the homeless, tramps, and paupers. The model law specified the administrative procedures by which individuals in each category could be identified, examined, and subjected to the sterilization procedure, and it was distributed to state legislatures and legal scholars as a practical drafting resource. It was used as such with a thoroughness that Laughlin had every reason to regard as a professional vindication. By 1931, 30 states had enacted compulsory sterilization laws drawing in whole or in part on the framework Laughlin's model law had provided. California had enacted its own sterilization statute as early as 1909 and would ultimately carry out more compulsory procedures under that authority than any other state in the country, approximately 20,000 between 1909 and 1979, when the program was finally discontinued. Virginia enacted its Eugenical Sterilization Act in 1924, establishing a procedure by which patients held in state institutions could be identified by institutional review boards as exhibiting hereditary forms of mental illness or intellectual disability and subjected to compulsory sterilization on that basis. It was a Virginia statute that would be carried to the Supreme Court 3 years after its enactment, in a legal proceeding that produced the most consequential judicial statement on eugenics in the history of American constitutional law. Carrie Buck had been born in Charlottesville, Virginia, in 1906, and had been placed in foster care at the age of 3 following the institutionalization of her mother, Emma Buck, who had been committed to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded in Lynchburg under a diagnosis of feeble-mindedness. Carrie was raised in Charlottesville by a foster family named Dobbs, attended school through the 6th grade before being withdrawn by the foster family to work in a household, 1923, by a nephew of her foster family. When her pregnancy became evident, the Dobbs family arranged for her commitment to the Virginia colony under the same diagnosis that had been applied to her mother, and she gave birth to a daughter, Vivian, at the colony in March of 1924. The colony superintendent, Albert Priddy, selected Carrie Buck as the test case through which the constitutionality of the new sterilization statute would be adjudicated, and a legal proceeding was constructed and carried forward to the Virginia courts, and then to the Supreme Court of the United States. The proceeding was, by ordinary standards of adversarial legal representation, a strikingly one-sided affair. The guardian appointed to represent Carrie Buck had personal and professional connections to the colony's administration and made no vigorous challenge to the scientific premises on which the sterilization order rested. Expert witnesses appearing on behalf of the colony, including Harry Laughlin, who testified in the form of a written deposition without appearing in person, characterized Carrie Buck and her mother as belonging to the hereditary class of feeble-minded of the lowest grade, drawing on pedigree data compiled by an eugenics record office-trained field worker who had examined what could be assembled of the Buck family history. Vivian Buck, who was less than 1 year old at the time of the relevant hearing, was assessed by a social worker named Matilda Dobbs, a relative of Carrie's foster family, who testified that the infant appeared not quite normal in her development. The Supreme Court heard the case in April of 1927 and issued its decision the following month, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writing for an 8-1 majority that upheld the Virginia sterilization statute as a valid exercise of the state's police power in the interest of public welfare. The opinion's most cited passage concluded with the observation that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, a sentence that expressed in 8 words of biological determinism and social arithmetic at the center of the eugenics program, carrying the full institutional weight of the country's highest court. Carrie Buck was sterilized at the Virginia colony in October of 1927. Her daughter Vivian attended the Venable School in Charlottesville in the early 1930s, and was described by her first-grade teacher as bright. Vivian died of an intestinal disease in 1932, at the age of 8, before she had accumulated any academic record of a kind that might have been placed in formal evidence against the characterization her condition had been given in court. Carrie Buck lived until 1983, residing for much of her adult life in modest circumstances in rural Virginia and West Virginia, and was visited and interviewed in her later years by researchers who found her to be a woman of entirely ordinary intelligence whose life history was in no material respect consistent with the hereditary diagnosis on which her institutionalization and surgical sterilization had rested. The Buck v. Bell decision has never been formally overruled by the Supreme Court and remains, technically, a binding legal precedent. The eugenics movement's presence in American public life during the 1920s extended well beyond the legislative and judicial arena into the texture of ordinary civic activity, in ways that gave eugenic ideas of visibility and social normalcy that purely academic or institutional channels could not have produced on their own. Fitter Families for a Future Firesides contests organized by the American Eugenics Society and held at state fairs across the country through the 1920s and into the 1930s, invited families to submit themselves voluntarily for a comprehensive medical and psychological examination by panels of evaluators trained in eugenic assessment. Participating families were graded on the health records, intelligence test results, and assess hereditary background of each member, and the winning families received medals, ribbons, and trophies in award ceremonies held, characteristically, in the livestock exhibition buildings of the fairgrounds where the same fairs judged cattle and horses in adjacent rings. A spatial association that was not accidental and that reflected the explicit analogy the eugenics movement drew between the selective breeding of animals and the reproductive principles it was advocating for human populations. Better Babies contests, a related initiative assessing infants against a combination of physical and developmental criteria drawn from eugenic and public health literature, were held at state fairs from the 1910s onward and attracted large attendances in multiple states. Iowa is credited with establishing the Better Babies format in its modern form, and the model spread to fairs in several dozen states over the following decade. The American Eugenics Society, founded in 1926 with offices initially in New Haven, Connecticut, served as the principal organizational vehicle for the movement's public engagement strategy during the decade's second half. Its founders and officers included figures from academic biology, medicine, social work, and law who shared the conviction that eugenic principles should inform not merely specialist scientific practice, but the ordinary social choices of citizens regarding marriage, reproduction, and the design of public institutions. Leon Whitney served as the Society's executive secretary through much of the late 1920s, overseeing a program of publications, public lectures, educational exhibitions, and correspondence with state legislators and civic organizations. Harry Olson, a Chicago municipal court judge who served on the Society's advisory structures, drew on eugenic principles in his approaches to criminal sentencing, arguing in published lectures that the court system should serve as an identification and management point for individuals whose hereditary constitution rendered them likely to reoffend regardless of the deterrent effects of conventional punishment. The society distributed eugenic educational materials to high schools and colleges and maintained a speakers bureau placing advocates before church congregations, women's organizations, and civic groups in communities across the country. By the mid-1920s, eugenics was taught as a component of biology, sociology, or public health curricula at more than 300 American colleges and universities, including institutions whose general academic reputations were such that their engagement with the field carried genuine credential-conferring weight for that field within educated public discourse. The field had its own peer-reviewed journals, its own professional associations, its own philanthropic funding streams, and attracted researchers whose institutional positions would, in almost any other discipline, have placed their conclusions beyond serious popular challenge. Madison Grant, a New York attorney and conservationist whose book The Passing the Great Race had been published in 1916, remained a prominent intellectual reference through the 1920s for the racial hierarchy that undergirded eugenic classification, arguing in successive editions and in magazine pieces that unrestricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe was producing a biological dilution of the Nordic element he credited with the principal achievements of American civilization. Lothrop Stoddard, a Massachusetts-born journalist whose 1920 book The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy constructed a complementary argument from a global demographic perspective, produced a text that was reviewed seriously in major American publications and that circulated through the same networks of educated readers who were engaging with Grant's work. The Immigration Act of 1924, known by the names of its congressional sponsors as the Johnson-Reed Act, codified eugenic-influenced ideas about national origin and racial hierarchy into federal immigration law. President Calvin Coolidge signed the act in May of that year, having stated in his annual message to Congress in December of 1923 that America must be kept American and that the principal underlying immigration restriction was racial in character. The act established national origin quotas that reduced annual immigration from Southern and Eastern European countries to small fractions of their previous levels, and it extended to its logical limit the existing series of exclusions that had since 1882 barred Chinese immigration by barring virtually all immigration from Asia. Harry Laughlin served as the expert eugenics agent for the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization through the years of the Act's drafting, providing testimony and written analysis designed to give the restriction program a biological scientific foundation, and appearing before the committee in a capacity that officially linked the authority of the Eugenics Record Office to the legislative record supporting the law's enactment. Adolf Hitler, writing in the Landsberg prison in Bavaria in 1924, cited American eugenic programs explicitly among the policy achievements he found worthy of study and emulation in Mein Kampf, published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926. The American Sterilization Laws, the 1924 Immigration Restriction, and the general framework of racial hygiene thinking developed at Cold Spring Harbor and disseminated through American academic and civic channels were identified in that text as evidence that the theoretical principles Hitler was articulating had already demonstrated their practical applicability in a functioning democratic state. German scientists and legal scholars visited Cold Spring Harbor and other American eugenics institutions during the 1920s and early 1930s, gathering materials, making professional contacts, and studying administrative procedures that they subsequently drew upon in designing the racial hygiene programs that became central features of German domestic policy after 1933 and that were ultimately implemented at a scale and with methods whose consequences would, in the following decade, make the American programs that had partly inspired them appear to many of their former supporters in a rather different light than they had appeared before. The scientific dissent that would eventually undermine eugenics as an intellectually defensible enterprise was present within biology and anthropology from early in the 1920s, but was not, through most of that decade, organized or institutionally prominent enough to significantly check the movement's expansion. Thomas Hunt Morgan, whose work on the chromosomal basis of heredity in fruit flies earned him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1933, expressed consistent skepticism about the claims that eugenic researchers were making regarding the inheritance of complex behavioral and social traits, arguing that the distance between what Mendelian genetics could demonstrate for simple physical characteristics and what eugenic field workers were claiming about intelligence and Moral character was too wide to be bridged by the data the Eugenics Record Office was producing. Franz Boas, the Columbia University anthropologist whose work was laying the foundations of modern cultural anthropology, challenged the racial premises underlying eugenic classification more broadly, arguing across a series of studies and public writings that the physical and cognitive differences between population groups that eugenicists treated as fixed hereditary endowments were substantially produced by the environmental conditions under which those groups had developed. Conditions that varied, and that could change within the span of a single generation in ways that the hereditary model could not account for. The evidence that Bowes and Morgan and their respective colleagues were accumulating would, over the course of the 1930s, contribute materially to the erosion of the scientific consensus that had sustained the eugenics program. That erosion, however, was a process measured in years and decades, not an immediate calendar of a single period. The 1920s closed with the eugenics program still legislatively expanding, still institutionally growing in its university presence, and still articulating its program in the mainstream language of progressive public health and scientific administration. What had begun to shift in the specialist literature and in the assessments of a minority of researchers working within the relevant disciplines was a confidence with which the program's central claims could be stated as established science rather than as contested hypothesis. That shift in confidence, once it had advanced far enough to register in the institutions that had conferred the program's legitimacy, would produce consequences for the sterilization laws, for the Eugenics Record Office, and for the broader academic apparatus that had sustained the movement, that were not yet visible at the decade's end, but that were, in retrospect, already underway in the basic conditions that made science self-correcting when it is permitted to be. The same decade that carried all of this as its ordinary texture, the government chemists calculating poison ratios, the factory supervisors teaching dial painters to shape their brushes with their lips, the breaker boys breathing anthracite dust in 10-hour shifts, the pharmacy counters displaying thallium creams and lead powders, and the state fair judges awarding medals to families of assessed hereditary quality, was a decade that described itself with considerable and apparently genuine conviction as scientific, as progressive, and as oriented toward the improvement of human welfare. That conviction was not merely rhetorical, and it was not uniformly wrong. It coexisted in the specific instances documented across these years, with consequences that the decade's institutions were, in most cases, entirely unprepared to recognize as such, and the distance between conviction and the consequences is, perhaps, the most instructive thing about the period. The five strands of ordinary life that ran through the 1920s in America were each addressed, in the years that followed, through processes that were slow, contested, and incomplete. The Prohibition framework dissolved in 1933, without legal accounting for the deaths the denaturing program had produced across 14 years of enforcement. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 placed the first durable federal limits on child labor, 34 years after the National Child Labor Committee had begun pressing Congress to act, and after two statutes and a constitutional amendment had each failed to survive the political and legal obstacles placed before them. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of that same year extended federal oversight to cosmetics for the first time in American legislative history, prompted as much by a medication disaster in the southern states as by the accumulated record of cosmetic harm that Ruth DeForest Lamb and Walter Campbell had spent years assembling the files of the Food and Drug Administration. The radium health industry contracted and disappeared under the combined weight of regulatory scrutiny and a medical case record that could not be reconciled by any reasonable reading with the marketing language in which its products had been presented to the public. The eugenics movement lost its scientific credibility gradually through the 1930s, and suffer more complete moral collapse as the consequences of the programs American institutions had partly inspired and partly instructed became legible in the record of what occurred in Europe between 1933 and 1945. None of these resolutions was clean or complete. The sterilization laws that Buck v. Bell had sanctioned in 1927 remain on the books in some states for decades after the Second World War, had made the word eugenics itself politically unusable in most mainstream contexts. The radium fixed in the bones of the dial painters of Orange, New Jersey, continued its work long after the litigation had concluded and the company had ceased to operate. The constitutional amendment that would have provided permanent federal authority over the labor children was never ratified, and the federal standard that finally addressed the problem rested on a constitutional reading that required a fundamental shift in the composition and orientation of the Supreme Court before it could be applied. What the 1920s shared across all 5 of these domains was not malice. Precisely, though malice was present in some of them. What it shared was a particular relationship between institutional confidence and institutional scrutiny, a readiness to act at scale, alongside a reluctance to examine the consequences of that action with the same care that had been brought to its initial design. The period believed itself to be scientific, progressive, and genuinely oriented toward the improvement of human welfare. In many respects, and across many domains not gathered here, it was, in the instances documented across this account, the belief and the evidence arrived, over time, at rather different conclusions, and the distance between them was measured not in months but in decades and in lives. The documentation that survives, the forensic records compiled by Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler, the photographs made by Lewis Hine, the court transcripts of Buck versus Bell, the medical case files assembled by the Food and Drug Administration, the pedigree charts of the Eugenics Record Office, hold the shape of what those years actually contained, without adjustment and without retrospective softening, for as long as anyone continues to examine it.